The neon glow of the roadside bar flickered against the wet pavement as David Cole stepped inside, shaking off the night chill. The place was nothing special, just another dive along a highway that had seen better days. A few regulars sat hunched over their drinks. The jukebox played something old and slow, and the scent of whiskey and fried food hung thick in the air. David moved to the counter, nodding at the bartender, a wiry man with tired eyes who looked like he'd seen his fair share of trouble. "Whiskey," David said, his voice even. "Neat." The bartender poured the drink without asking questions. There was something in David's presence, a quietness, a certainty, that made most people instinctively leave him alone. David had learned long ago that the loudest men in the room were usually the weakest, the ones who had something to prove, something to yell about. Those were the ones who had never really been tested. He took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn, and let his shoulders relax. He wasn't here for trouble, he just wanted some silence. But trouble had a way of finding men like him. In the far corner of the bar, a group of bikers sat clustered around a table, their laughter sharp and mean. Leather jackets, heavy boots, the smell of beer and sweat. David didn't pay them any attention at first. He'd been in enough places like this to know the type. But then one of them, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, Reed, noticed him. "Well, look at this," Reed muttered to his crew, nudging the man beside him, Jacko, who was even bigger, 6'4", 300 pounds of a badly placed muscle. Guy walks in here like he owns the place. David kept his eyes on his drink, ignoring them. Jacko grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Maybe we ought to introduce ourselves." The bartender, Charlie, had seen it coming from the moment David walked in. He recognized the kind of calm that sat in the stranger's posture, the way his hands never fidgeted, the way his shoulders were loose but ready. Charlie leaned against the counter. "Best let this one drink in peace," he said casually. Reed chuckled. "Come on, Charlie, we're just being friendly." Jacko pushed off from the table, rolling his shoulders as he approached David's seat. The bar had gone quiet now. People sensed something shifting in the air, something beneath the surface, something dangerous. Jacko shoved David's shoulder. "Hey," he said, his breath thick with beer. "We're talking to you." David didn't move, didn't flinch, just took another slow sip of his whiskey. Jacko frowned, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. "You deaf, old man?" Still, nothing. Reed smirked, deciding to up the stakes. He walked over, grabbed David's whiskey glass, and poured it out onto the counter. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Looks like you're all out." The bartender stiffened. That was the moment. The line had been crossed. David finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He took the napkin from the counter and wiped the spilled drink without saying a word. Then, at last, he looked up. Jacko felt a strange sensation in his gut. It was the eyes. Not angry, not afraid, just focused, controlled. David set the napkin down, tilting his head slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, even. "You gonna buy me another one?" Jacko chuckled, but there was uncertainty in it now. "You got a death wish, Grandpa?" David exhaled slowly, measuring the distance between them. He'd seen men like Jacko before, men who mistook size for power. Jacko reached for his jacket, just to yank him up, just to show him who was in charge. Big mistake. David moved, faster than any of them expected. Jacko's wrist was suddenly trapped in an iron grip, then twisted. Jacko let out a strangled sound, half growl, half yelp, as his knees buckled from the pain. The entire bar froze. And that was when Reed lunged. David let go of Jacko and pivoted. His movements were fluid, practiced, SEAL training embedded deep in his bones. He caught Reed's arm mid-swing, turned his weight against him, and sent him crashing into the bar stools. Silence. Reed groaned on the ground, trying to regain his breath. Jacko staggered back, clutching his wrist. He looked at David now with something different, not anger, not arrogance, something closer to fear. David adjusted his jacket, took his seat again, and finally he spoke. "Walk away." His voice was calm, not a threat, a promise. Jacko and Reed hesitated, muscles still tense, their instincts screaming at them to get even, but their survival instincts screamed louder. A few heartbeats passed. Then, without a word, they left. The bar remained still. People exhaled. Charlie, the bartender, shook his head, sliding a fresh whiskey in front of David. "On the house," he muttered. A man at a nearby table leaned over to his buddy. "Who the hell was that guy?" Charlie wiped down the counter, watching as David took a slow sip of his fresh drink, his expression unchanged. "Someone you don't mess with?" Jacko and Reed stormed out of the bar, their boots thudding against the pavement as they disappeared into the cold night. The door swung shut behind them, leaving behind a bar full of people staring. Nobody said a word. David exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the tension in his muscles unwinding like a coil. He lifted his fresh whiskey, took a sip, and let the slow burn settle in his chest. Back to normal. But the room wasn't back to normal. The energy had shifted. He could feel it. The bartender, Charlie, was still behind the counter, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. He stole glances at David every few seconds, his mind working through the puzzle of what had just happened. A few of the regulars were whispering, watching. One of them, a younger guy with a trucker hat and wide eyes, finally spoke. "You military?" David didn't answer, just took another sip. Charlie smirked. "Son, that ain't just military." He turned to David. "You served, didn't you?" David set his glass down. His silence was answer enough. The young guy whistled low under his breath. "Jesus, no wonder those guys took off." Charlie nodded, rubbing his jaw. "I seen tough men before, but the way you handled those boys, that ain't bar fight training." David wasn't in the mood for a conversation about his past. He had spent too many years trying to leave it behind, but it always followed him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He sighed. "They won't be back." Charlie chuckled. "Damn right they won't." But David wasn't so sure. He had been in enough fights to know that some men, when beaten, stay down, and others, they come back with something worse. David had just finished his drink when the door swung open again. This time, he didn't even have to turn around. He could feel it. Reed and Jacko were back, and they weren't alone. 4 more men walked in behind them, bigger, meaner, the kind of guys who had been called in to finish something. David set his glass down and glanced toward the bartender. Charlie was already reaching under the bar, probably for a bat or a gun. Jacko stood just inside the door, his jaw clenched tight. "You made me look like a fool," he growled. David turned slightly on his bar stool, taking them in. They were agitated, but also uncertain. His calmness unsettled them. "I gave you a chance to walk away," David said simply. Reed took a step forward. "Yeah? Well, now you don't get that chance." The bar fell silent again. The men spread out, forming a loose semicircle around David. David sighed. He had tried to avoid this, but some men never learn. Then Jacko pulled a knife. The steel caught the light as he flicked it open, the blade gleaming sharp and mean. David's gaze darkened. "Last chance," he said, his voice like stone. "You walk away now, no one gets hurt." Jacko grinned. "Oh, we're way past that." And he lunged. David moved before Jacko's blade could get within a foot of him. His left hand snatched Jacko's wrist mid-air, twisting it so fast that a sickening pop echoed through the bar. Jacko screamed, the knife clattering to the floor. Then David spun him, slamming his head into the nearest table with a dull crack. Reed was already moving, trying to throw a punch, but David caught it, deflected it, and drove his knee into Reed's ribs. The biker collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The rest of the men hesitated. They weren't expecting this. David could see it in their eyes. Fear, doubt. One of them rushed him anyway. David sidestepped, grabbed the guy by the collar, and sent him crashing into another. The 2 of them toppled over, knocking over chairs. The last man standing had already started backing toward the door. David didn't chase him. He never needed to. The fight was over before it even really began. Jacko was still groaning on the floor, clutching his twisted wrist. Reed was spitting blood. And the rest of them? They weren't getting up anytime soon. David adjusted his jacket and exhaled. The bar was dead silent. Charlie blinked, shaking his head. Jesus Christ. The younger guy from before just stared. David turned back to the bartender. "Think I'll take that last drink to go?" Charlie nodded. "Yeah, you got it." He poured the whiskey into a Togo cup, sliding it across the counter. David picked it up, took a slow sip, then started toward the door. Reed, still on the ground, coughed and spoke weakly. Who the hell are you?" David didn't even look back. Someone you don't mess with. And then he walked out. The fight was over, but the legend was just beginning.